Warning: the following podcast contains graphic content that may be disturbing or triggering to some listeners. Discretion is advised. The Papa Tango Sierra Delta podcast is available free of charge thanks to the support of Cracked Armor.
Their mission is to raise awareness for PTSD, TBI, and mental health to support those who struggle. By creating an army of warriors who represent the gear, their hope is that it will send a message to others that they are not alone.
Go to crackedarmor.com, say hi to Mark Long, read about the story, and find some research information about PTSD. And if you can, look good while supporting Cracked Armor by buying some gear.
(10-9). Did you say Papa Tango Sierra Delta? 10-4.
There's so much left to do, so many things I wanna say, and I say, don't make the change. If it rains every single day, I'll fight to blow it all away.
This is episode 29 of the Papa Tango Sierra Delta podcast. My name is Larry Payton, and I have been diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress. I was attending a reboot recovery session on Monday evening. This is the one I've spoken about before. It's based out of Tennessee. I'm doing it virtually. It's a 12-week program that's been going well. It's all about PTSD recovery with some basis on faith. It was a pleasure to be invited by Scott and Andrea to take part in the program. This past Monday was a tough session. We got into talking about guilt, true guilt and false guilt. And so what they describe it as is true guilt is when you legitimately do something wrong. So I don't know, you didn't look when you backed up into the driveway and you hit your wife's vehicle. Yeah, that's your fault. You did that. But you can also make a 180-degree turn from that, and from now on, you need to look behind you when you back up. Likewise, if you're speeding, police officer pulls you over. Well, there you go. Yeah, you were speeding. You were at fault. I understand why you feel guilty. That is a true guilt. And you can correct that. But then there's false guilts. And false guilts, I didn't realize, are what, well, fucks with my mind. False guilts are things that you feel guilty about, but there's either nothing you could have done about the situation, or there's nothing that you've done wrong. There's no fixing it. There's no turning 180 from it because you didn't do anything wrong. As they were talking about this, I completely dissociated and went somewhere else and couldn't stop thinking about a motor vehicle collision that happened when I was posted in Alberta. I won't get into the particulars about it other than to say there was a girl who was visiting her boyfriend down in Brooks. She was from northern part of Alberta. And she was supposed to drive home that evening to get back in time for work. Her boyfriend and herself, in consultation with her folks, decided, you know what, I think it would be safer if you didn't drive at night. Get up in the morning, drive back then, go to your shift. Good idea. The issue is, when she got up the next morning and drove on Highway 36, she hit a huge bank of fog. Fog that I've never seen in that area before. And I'd been there for several years, but hadn't seen anything like that. She was driving a smaller car, and she was headed northbound on 36. Unfortunately, there was a drunk driver who, although it was something like 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning, was driving drunk and driving fast and hit that car head on. As a result, that young lady died. She was an only child, and it obviously was devastating to her parents. The drunk driver, and yeah, a little bit of damage to the truck. I don't even know if he had a scratch on him. What got me thinking, though, about this false guilt is that several weeks later, I went up to northern Alberta to have lunch with her parents. They wanted to talk to me I guess it was for closure. And they'd wanted to see a photo of the collision scene. I really didn't think that was a good idea. I took a photo with me, but I really, again, didn't think it was a good idea to show our parents. So we had lunch, we talked, tears were shed, and at the end of the meal, when we were getting up to depart, the mom went to the restroom. That's when Dad had asked if he could see that picture. He needed to see it for closure. So I showed him. And he broke down, fell to his knees, and begged me, no matter what, to not show his wife. He had picked himself up before she returned from the washroom. Still tears in his eyes. And they left. That stuck with me, and I felt guilty about it. And I think the guilt I felt about it was almost the guilt of a parent. The guilt of what it would feel like if I was in their shoes. And it haunts me, absolutely haunts me to this day, to think about ever experiencing such a fucking traumatic event. I don't know what I would do if I have a conversation with my daughter and we decide the best thing to do for her is to drive in the light. Only to find out that when you think it's safer, she was struck by a drunk driver and died instantly at the scene. It chokes me up just thinking about it. So I've carried that guilt amongst a shit ton more of guilt over my ears. And as much as in the Reboot Recovery course they talk about letting it go because it's a false guilt, and there can be no redemption for a false guilt because you didn't do anything for which you need to be redeemed, which makes it worse for me because it sticks with me, and I still feel guilty about that. I don't know if I could have done something more. I could have got to the scene faster. I don't know. But my guilt goes beyond being a first responder who attended. My guilt bleeds into that as a parent of her surviving parents, of what they have gone through, of the years that have passed, all the Christmases, all the birthdays, family vacations. Their sole child was taken from them. That's something I'm going to need to work through. The only takeaway from that today for you is to take a look at your own guilts. Take a look at what is a true guilt and what is a false guilt. Identify them. Separate them. Things that are true guilts, accept it. Own it. Make a change so you don't feel guilty about something like that ever again. The false guilts, yeah, you're going to need to process those. You're going to need some time to think about that. You're going to need some time to try and realize that that is nothing that was caused by you, that was failed to be done by you, that you could have prevented, that you're at fault for. I'm going to be still working through mine, I know that. And it's going to take time. But all we can do is keep pushing forward. And remember, forward is not always miles. Inches and feet count as well. Just keep pushing forward. Raise your head. Be cool with those scars that are on your body, for you earned them. They show that you survived. They show that you've been to hell and back, and they are part of you. Be cool with them being part of you. I'm okay with mine. Let's take a quick break. Please leave a rating at your preferred podcasting service. Hey, you know what's even better than a rating? If you take a moment to actually write a review. That'd be awesome. And we are back from the break. Thank you for staying tuned to the Papa Tango Sierra Delta podcast. On today's episode, I'd like to welcome Eric Tung, a police officer out of Washington State, who hosts the podcast called Blue Grit Radio. Welcome to the show, Eric.
Hey, thanks, Larry. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And for those who are listening on Blue Grit Radio, you're like, wait now, did I tune into the wrong podcast? What's happening?
Yeah.
Today is going to be a dual show. So you are getting a taste on both platforms, on Papa Tango Sierra Delta and on Blue Grit Radio, of the same show, where Eric and I are going to fast fire questions back and forth to each other and see which one we can trip up first. I'm just joking.
Yeah.
I'm joking.
Sudden death.
That's right. It is sudden death. Eric, please introduce yourself, your podcast. Give us a lowdown.
Yeah. So I've been in police work in Washington State for going on 16 years. I didn't grow up wanting to be a cop, but I kind of had that coming of age and that soul search. Finishing college, or I think as our neighbors to the north say, university. You say that right?
That's right. Exactly.
Okay. Hey, I'm culturally competent. So towards the midpoint, rounding out university, I just wanted to do something important. I always had an affinity towards those that served, and the idea of a life of service. And I just didn't know in what direction that was, but I just kind of went for it. And I didn't really know any police officers, but I tested for police and fire, and a lot of doors were opening. In 2007, we had the recession and a lot of troops overseas, and it was just a perfect time for me to get hired and have opportunities to choose where to be a cop. And I think a lot of young listeners can sympathize with that now. A lot of my listeners are those that are coming into the career or newer officers. And so, it was kind of just a jump in the deep end, working in a pretty busy agency, about 150 officers, pretty high crime. And I was just kind of along for the ride. I mean, my career's gone a lot of different directions that I didn't anticipate, from actual official assignments, as well as just what I've found in health and wellness. And so that's become a real passion of mine, is partially by interest and partially by necessity, leaning into all the different factors of just general health. I got really into fitness because of canine and wanting to be really, quick and strong and agile and all those things. And then, I fell into the mental health side. I've been involved with peer support at my department for the majority of my career. And, I really lean heavy on my guys, and I encourage them to do it back to me. But that really came to a much more significant level when I lost one of my friends in duty, close friends. So that basically sparked my desire to build our program a lot more. I was a sergeant at the time, and I recognized that peer support was functioning well, but it could really use a lot more juice as far as what a rank could do for coordination and scheduling and getting a little bit more administrative buy-in and funding and all the things. So that really took off that angle. And post George Floyd, the death of George Floyd was really where I decided to kind of open up on social media. I was comfortable posting with my friends and some of my reflections about police work, some of our challenges, and I got a lot of good feedback to the point where a lot of people are saying, hey, I wish that there were more cops, or we need more cops like you, Eric. And my initial response was really just one of frustration, where I was like, man, if you only knew the guys and gals I work with, there's so many great cops. And so my efforts in Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram and starting the blog at bluegritwellness.com and now the podcast is really just to put information out there. It's, it started as more of a health focus, mental, physical, but then it's also just kind of going in tandem with all the things in my assignment. So a lot of it's hiring, a lot of it's finding and providing information for those that are coming into the career, because we need good cops. And so just to connect and take away a lot of the mystery of all things law enforcement.
That's awesome, man. Awesome. And I couldn't agree with you more. There are a ton of great cops. I can't say I've honestly worked with one that I would say anything shit about. Certainly the boots in the trenches, for sure.
You're a lot nicer than I am.
Yeah, well, yeah. No, there's
but
some assholes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
But
Like,
there's some great ones.
there's
Yeah.
a lot of people, so many people, like, you know, in the background, right? Like, I'm on social media and I'm currently one of our recruiters, so I'm very much in the forefront. So people have this public image perception, right? But there's so many people that just do the humble, quiet work that we never hear about, never learn about.
Absolutely. And that to me was part of what you are capturing on Blue Grit Radio. And so to your listeners, I'll introduce myself. My name is Larry Payton. I am a member with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP. 21 plus years of service, working on my 22nd. However, I've been off since the first week of December of 2022 with symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress. As a result, I have commenced with this podcast to provide a background, I guess, of support to stand up and speak out for those who are frontliners, military, social workers, nurses, corrections officers, anyone who is struggling with post-traumatic stress. And for your new listeners or your listeners that are new members, I'm the grumpy old bastard. So Eric's a nicer guy, even though he says I am. That's not true. That's not true, Eric.
How many years do you have in now?
I completed my 21st in March, so I'm working on 22 right now.
Congrats. Good for you.
Thanks, brother. I appreciate it. And you?
16 this summer. So, yeah. I don't know what you feel about this statement, but at sometimes I feel like it's crawling, and then other moments I feel like it's slowing, right? So it's kind of both extremes.
When I was at Depot, which is our academy, one of our instructors had stated, guys, enjoy your career because it goes by so fast. And when I was working alone, which in my first detachment, you were completely alone. There was no backup, 45 minutes away. And I sat there in the cruiser in the pitch black thinking that instructor was completely and utterly lying his ass off because it was going very, very slow. Funny enough, though, you fast forward to 21 years and you look back and go, no, man, that flew by pretty quick for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Eric, what's the state down there with regards to mental health support for your police officers? I mean, it's a big issue. The suicide epidemic is a huge problem here. And we frequently see frontliners south of our border who are deciding to extinguish their lights. If you could speak to the state of mental health and what's going on with your police service or in the state of Washington to ensure that we're providing the services that members need.
It is a big issue, and it's a big question. And, you know, I talk about this a lot with my peers, with my team, and I talk a lot with folks like you, right, now that I'm connecting with more people, kind of share stories and share experiences, what's going well across state lines and things like that. And what I can say is that, unfortunately, it is a huge epidemic, right? It's a continued issue. I don't want to dwell on the negative, and I do want to pay credit to those that are doing the work, and thank you for doing the work. But a lot of that's just awareness, right? And it's having the difficult, uncomfortable conversations. I think that what I hear is that some administrations seem like they're helpful with their guys. I just talked to an officer that I know from a nearby department, and he's going through the PTSD claim, and he's having a relatively decent experience with that. So that's really great to hear. However, I also hear stories where that's not the case, right? I do hear stories where someone has the courage and the fortitude to come forward and say they need help. It's all the things we're saying that they ought to need to do. So applause there. But they're not getting the reception that they need, and they're not getting a reception that's constructive. In plain terms, they're basically getting called out. Or not believed, right? And so it's so frustrating to hear that kind of example, because that's exactly what's going to prevent people from stepping up, doing the right thing, doing the brave thing, and the uncomfortable thing, in recognition that they need to get some help. But I guess my last little bit I want to insert is there are a lot of organizations, and it seems like there's more I'm learning about in the region or on this, the West Coast and all that are there for officers, right? Maybe if their agencies are not, or their employers are not. There's a lot of, volunteers, and there's a lot of organizations that are coming up to provide that care and help them navigate that, help them facilitate their road to recovery.
That's awesome. And I mean, I think you're hitting the nail on the head there, Eric, with regards to that comment about how you've got one member who's having a pretty decent experience and others who are not. I personally think that a huge need, the outreach, fantastic, absolutely, and the discussions with regards to it, absolutely. But what members need to truly feel is that they can trust their own organization to the point that they truly believe their organization has their six. And that's a problem because so many members are terrified about, stigmatization, whether it be from other members in the bullpen or management or just the service as a whole. They're concerned about, are they going to come and all of a sudden label me to where now I'm on desk duty? They're going to take my service pistol away. They're going to, treat me completely differently. And the reality is that we just need to be open to allow members to get rid of those fears, I guess, to be able to oust those concerns. That, to me, that's obviously huge to be able to do that. The other side of it as well, sorry, go ahead.
You're talking about trust, right? We need to be able to trust that our bosses have our backs. And that's so hard. And I'm not trying to point fingers per se, as much as I'm just trying to illustrate the landscape now, which is, whether it's mental health support or just the job. I don't think that there's ever been a time where officers across the nation or nations, right, internationally, have felt more susceptible towards the outcomes of things and whether or not their bosses would affect that, right? And then that could be just their actions on the street and just lower morale, more fractured cultures in different departments in different regions. I think that when you're already facing that tension or fragile trust, if you could call it that, in some places I know it's much worse than that. If you don't feel that trust and that support in general, then how are you going to feel it with such a sensitive topic that could be your gun and your badge, your livelihood, providing for your family, right? All these very, very significant things. It's tough.
Absolutely, brother. And the other side of it as well is, look, this is the catch-22 for coppers, is that we're generally used to every day, every shift, every hour, someone is lying to us, bullshitting us, trying to get themselves out of trouble, trying to whatever, just bullshit. And I have no issue saying that's a reality.
Yeah.
But when you start to really, you live that for several years, well, you all of a sudden can't help but question almost everything that goes on around you. How much is this person really being honest? How much are they shitting me? And that can bleed into our own culture, our own, inner sanctity within the police force, because we sometimes tend to look at someone who's not doing well and kind of wonder, but are you really not doing well? Or is this true? Is this not true? What's going on here? Are you just trying to get some more vacation time?
Right.
And don't get me wrong, I agree, Eric, there are people out there who are, well, I don't even know if there are words to them, who take advantage of such things.
Sure.
But, as cops, it's very difficult for us to want to step up and talk, and for us even to want to believe other members, because, again, man, all we hear is crap every day from people who are just trying to get out of something, right?
Yeah, and this reminds me of a conversation I had with a police leader in my area that I really respect. I respect the hell out of him, and I think that it was he is a peer supporter, and so that's his leaning, but just the notion that he, just to try to be in the middle or moderate, saying, hey, we, like you're saying, Larry, we recognize there will be those people that are going to abuse a system or use a system. But what I like that he said is that you just have to accept that and take that loss, because you have to accept the fact that you might support or enable some people to take advantage in a system that's supportive of those suffering, because the cost is too great not to. The cost is too great when you can lose the life of an officer. You can have an officer or a first responder take their own life if the system is not supportive to giving them the help, if the system has some friction and these hoops and obstacles, you know what I mean? So just to accept that loss. And so I really respected that position, and it made me really hopeful, especially a higher ranking command staff personnel, to take that notion, because it's going to take people like him in positions of higher rank to say that and to socialize it. And then eventually, like most things, progress is slow, but eventually my hope is that, people of a higher ranking command staff they'll be the anomaly if they push back too hard. because I do agree with that. The cost is just far too great to create that level of scrutiny or these quote unquote safeguards just to preserve it from the small minority that may abuse it.
This is a mic drop moment, Eric, like abso-freaking-lutely. And this is exactly the switch in mentality we need at an upper management level. And I know it's going to take time, and it's certainly not going to be overnight. It's going to be past my career, but it's an acceptance. It's a reality that if you do this job, you are quite susceptible to having a post-traumatic stress injury. You're going to see, you're going to smell, you're going to touch, you're going to hear trauma. And it's going to be around you a lot in your career. And so it's about the organization fully being aware of same and accepting same, and then taking the steps early in members' careers to speak to your younger or new members that are joining police forces. Start talking early. Create that relationship. You may not experience a thing in the least about PTSD yet, but understand that you're going to see a lot of shit, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And those members need to get out and start talking and establishing their peer support groups, establishing, a trust level with a therapist. And at least when you start feeling like things are a little off, everything's in place already for you, as opposed to so many other people like myself are all of a sudden drowning and reaching for whatever stick they can find. Is it difficult down there, Eric, to get help, to get therapists? I know in Canada, man, it's a huge struggle. Our health system is, as much as it's great, but it's also, you're waiting for sometimes 12 hours in a waiting room, and that's for a physical injury. For mental health, they're turning away people left, right, and center because there just isn't enough psychologists and psychiatrists. Any idea what the state is like down there?
Yeah, I think it depends, right? You can find someone, and let's just talk about first responders with good insurance and good network. Yeah, you can go online and find someone. But before I forget, I do want to say, for the people coming in, I do love that point that you brought up, and actually talked about that with a counselor in my podcast recently. But just the notion of find your therapist before you need your therapist, right? And so it's not easy to talk about this stuff, right? It's not easy to talk about it with our buddies, even our close ones or our spouse, family. And so it's certainly not easy to talk with a stranger. So, hey, before you need that, just know, hey, if you're coming into one of these careers, high stress, high trauma, then just establish that rapport and you find someone that you can get along with or carry on a conversation pretty well and you feel comfortable with, right? Like before you have to talk about the heavy stuff. Maybe you just talk about normal stress and talk about parenting. You talk about your normal stress of your daily life and bills. And then at the point where you have a critical incident or more, or a ton, then you can dial that up. But yeah, to go back to the original question, and it depends, but I think that what I've heard is with therapists, practitioners that are first respond trauma trained, yes, it is hard. I think she said it this way too with a side comment, but saying that it's good and bad for those types, because it's good in that it shows that people are utilizing the services, they're utilizing these practitioners, but it's bad that you can't get enough, right? So we need more counselors and psychiatrists that are well versed in this. But I do like something that I heard from another counselor, which is, hey, don't sacrifice talking to someone if you can't get in with, someone that is emergency services specifically trained. And also there is a organization in my area called Code 4 Northwest, and they have relationships and vetted counselors, so they can get you in contact if you're in that critical moment quickly. Whether it's a question of whether they can take on a client ongoing at a high frequency, that might be a different story, but at least you can get in to talk to someone quickly with the help of some of these agencies. So I don't know if you have something like that or you're aware of something like that up in your region.
Yeah, there's different ones. So one, for example, that's being set up in Alberta right now is called Boots on the Ground, and it's a complete volunteer service. They're hoping to get it lifted off in September of this year. Again, it'll be all first responders. No one will necessarily be trained in terms of providing you with the, psychological or therapeutic support that you need, other than you will be speaking to someone who has been through the shit and that you don't know. So if you're having trouble, speaking to the other guys or girls on your shift, on your watch, in your department, then again, during a time of difficulty when things can be getting critical, or before, hopefully, you can call out to the boots on the ground in Alberta and be able to speak shit through and get some stuff off your mind. They also have boots on the ground in Ontario, the original one. And there's other, organizations that are set up nationally in terms of phone numbers to call, but I certainly prefer these ones because I find it difficult. And I'm not sure, Eric, if you ever have, but I find it difficult talking to people who don't understand kind of my jargon, my, police talk or frontliner talk or whatever. And I get frustrated when, they're asking too many questions about what does that mean? And so it's something else to be able to speak with someone who does understand your jargon. I mean, do you find that easier when you talk to someone like that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely ideal, right? It's anything that you can do to remove that obstacle, right? And sometimes that obstacle is pausing and thinking about how to phrase something so they get it. And I think that with therapy, with any kind of care like that, you don't want to be judged. That's really the crux of it, right? You want to establish trust and not feel judged. So just the fact that someone gets it, and quote unquote gets it, is huge. And so if you can establish that and be comfortable with someone and find them, before that really terrible moment, that's great. But yeah, I mean, definitely ideal. But I would still encourage those that that you can't get someone in right away. Like, yeah, I mean, ultimately, I hope that people are going to reach out to someone to talk about their problems, even if it's just because it is, a professional that can help in some regard. But you're absolutely right, man.
I mean, the reality is, I don't understand sometimes, but I mean, we're seeing these suicides again daily. I just saw within the last, maybe 2 or 3 weeks up here, we've had 4 military veterans that have committed suicide in Canada, which, that sticks. You're like, what the hell is going on? What's happening here? These are not old guys. These are not, these are young men and women that are struggling. So, Eric, if you anything you want to ask or whatever, feel free as well for your listeners. I want to make sure that we cover off the Blue Grit radio side of things.
I want to know what your origin story is. Like, what brought you to service? We'll start there, and so just so you have a little teaser, kind of want to know your reflections on that at this point, the place where you're sidelined, but you're open and you're courageous to share your story and your experiences with that.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. So it seems to be that I think I come from pretty much a service family, so to speak. My grandfather was in the Royal Marines in the Second World War, and he was a fire chief in Newfoundland and Labrador on the east coast of Canada. My father, who was the youngest of 4 boys, became a police officer in the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary. He served 30 years there. And as I mentioned, my listeners will hear, I've spent pretty much my entire youth always wanting to know what he knew, but he just never really spoke about it. So I decided I was going to follow his tracks. I originally was in law school, decided that wasn't for me, thank God, and then ended up going the policing route and decided to join the federal side with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I joined out of Newfoundland, so I'm from a city on the far east coast of the country, and my first posting was in a very small town on the west side of the country in Alberta. It was a huge culture shock, but it worked out well for us. There was a lot of great people. Were there some not so great people? Well, sure, obviously, or I wouldn't have a job. But there's a lot
always, right? Yeah.
There's a lot of great people. From there, I did 4.5 years there. From there, I went to Calgary and worked on a joint forces operation with Calgary Police Service in drugs, and then did a little stint over in integrated organized crime. From there, I went to Customs and Excise, got my first hooks to corporal in Ottawa, and then I transferred over here where I'm in Halifax now in Nova Scotia, back on the east side, and I'm a sergeant, an NCOIC in charge of a National Weapons Enforcement Support Team. So basically, we're firearm specialists is what my team really does. In terms of, me and how did I get where I am? Well, yeah, man, 21 years of things just really start kind of compiling. And I'm very, very proud of what I do. I'm proud to say the organization for which I work. Do I think everything that the RCMP has done throughout its 150 years of service has been great? No. Do I think every single member who has worn the same uniform as me has been great? No. But I really do believe that the far greater number of them have genuinely been there to do what they felt was best in every situation. I do genuinely believe that the organization has genuinely had the care and concern of the people in this country and in the communities at hand. And I again believe that policing is an honorable job to have. It's difficult, it's hard, but I do still maintain pride. And in terms of getting to where I am now with regards to talking about it, well, yeah, man, carrying around years and years of it was tough. And then there was an incident here about 3 years ago that happened that I was involved in, and there were some major changes. I noticed somewhat, but I didn't really notice a whole bunch, Eric. But my wife certainly did, and my kids certainly did. And that was when they had said I need to speak to someone. So I did. And here we are 3 years later, and I'm still having weekly sessions. There's a lot there that I've been carrying and I'm trying to work through. And the podcast was born out of that. I mean, I, for a long time, did not want to speak to anyone about this. I felt embarrassed. I felt weak. I mean, and here's the reality, Eric, and you know this. I mean, if you're going to be a cop, but you need to have that combat mentality down. You need to make sure that you get home at the end of every shift. You need to always have your eyes moving, nonstop. Be aware of what's going around you. Make sure you watch your 12, your 6, your 9, your 3. I mean, it's just constant needing to be alert and lit and ready. I mean, that does, after a while, start tiring you out and wearing you down. And that also starts becoming part of your normal daily life. Your normal routine is looking and paying attention to things. And all of a sudden, for me at least, I'm not understanding why I'm so exhausted. I'm not understanding why I can't ever turn it off, that kind of little police thing. And again, to go back to just being embarrassed about it, yeah, I was embarrassed to have it. I mean, we're supposed to be tough. We're supposed to push forward. But when I started to get a sense of how many other people were struggling like me, and I felt like I was alone. I mean, logically, Eric, I knew I wasn't, but damn, it certainly felt like I was.
Yeah.
And so it just came to talking to my therapist about this. She thought it was going to be a good idea for me and for others. And so I rolled it out at the end of January. And I expected it would be an episode a month, very small listenership, but that's okay. Just being there for people who were struggling in silence. And yeah, it is now, I mean, after the first 2 days of the first episode being released, all of a sudden there was a need for it to be a weekly show that's now been heard in 18 countries, and there's thousands of downloads. It's just been unbelievable. And the reality is, there's a lot of people who are struggling in silence and either are afraid to step up because of repercussions, because of stigmatization, because of concerns or whatever, or they just don't know how to verbalize what's going on.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of my journey to where I am now.
I love that, man. And that, to key in on a couple things is like that feeling of being alone. And it's not logical, but it's real. You feel that, and so it is. And then you are alone until you're not, until you recognize and you overcome and you talk to people, you do the work that you need. So applause for that. And then what's pretty beautiful about that is through this project that you have already recognized has helped you, what's fueling you is helping all of these others, right? And so it's just putting out more of this. It's true leadership, and it's true leadership by example, to share your story. And then, man, how many people internationally now that don't have to feel alone because you're sharing your story. Other men and women are coming on your podcast to share their story. That's what's going to be more impactful than someone just saying in police academy, saying, "Hey, you should talk to someone." All right, next subject. Right?
That's true. Yeah, no, it's true, man.
Like, you're a real person. You're a real dude with a extensive career. You've been a lot of places. You've done a lot of things with police. And so I think I know the answer to this question, but were you provided any of that information when you got trained up as a new cop in academy?
Zero. Absolutely zero. Yeah, it just what didn't exist.
So it's improving, right? Because and granted, I think that my area, pretty close to Seattle, is it's more progressive. Being on the coast of the U.S. Than a lot of places, certainly. But we covered some things. They provide reading material. They said, hey, you should read this. You should read Gil Martin, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. You should have your family read it. So like most things, it sits on the shelf, or you go through the PowerPoint and you remember some things. But even from peer support, when we do stress debriefs, we make a point to remind people. I'm like, hey, I know you know this, but we need to hear it. And every time I hear it, I'm reminded, right? Every time I go to a mental health based training, like I'm reminded of so many things that are deep down in there, but you need to be reminded of it because it's not normalized. It's not obvious, right? So whether it's the hypervigilance that you're talking about, where you're always on guard, you're always on defense. Yes, that does happen in your time off. Yes, that does happen in your own backyard, where you hear something and you're trying to figure out where's your gun, how quick can you get there, or do you just grab the barbecue tongs and fight something? You have these thoughts of how are you going to survive this irrational thing, but you are literally conditioned that way to survive. I mean, that's what's kept you and I alive, and a lot of our, no doubt, a lot of our sketchy things is these things we're trained to do, and these ways we're trained to act.
Even then, it's not so much that when you survive something and walk out of it and you go, damn, I am the shit. No, it's that constant reassessment where it's like, all right, you know what? I didn't look over there. Maybe there could have been something there that time, or shit. All right, I need to be better prepared on my entry. I was in that fatal funnel for maybe a bit too long. And you're constantly going, at least I am constantly going back through every situation so that I get closer and closer to, for lack of a better term, perfecting it. There's no such thing, but lowering your weaknesses, I guess, your chances of something bad happening, and trying to make yourself that much safer on whatever call you're dealing with. And Eric, I appreciate what you said about the podcast and myself, and the exact same goes for you. I mean, you're a 16-year member who really has his shit together and is doing some fantastic things. I mean, your podcast didn't start a couple of months ago. You've been doing this for a while, and you're really helping not only police officers, but also the public with regards to their perception of police officers and frontliners, with regards to how people can prepare for exams, look at getting into the police service. I mean, these things, again, when I was looking, didn't exist.
Right.
So I would love if you tell my listeners more about your podcast and some of the things that you've covered.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm trying to span a few things, but really one of your themes of, like, you already identified it, was just bridging, right? Whether it's for people in the industry, whether it's people from without that are trying to get in, or people that are just on the outside that have no interest to be a law enforcement officer or a corrections officer. But really, it's just trying to provide that open conversation. I took a lot of personal notes and a lot of personal reflection, like I said, after the death of George Floyd, but a lot of those lessons were through my career, right? And I'm not saying I have not always been officer friendly. I have not always been the PR public engagement officer. It was actually quite the contrary early in my career. I mean, I think some of my first public engagement things came with being a canine and having to do show and tell, whether it was community groups, Rotary Club kind of stuff, or schools, presentations for grade school kids. I didn't want to do any of it because literally that was time I was at work that I did not have as much availability to get after it and find the bad guys that were going to run, going to flee, all those things, going to fight. I literally felt like it was me not being operational, right? And so to even go from that dynamic to now trying to interface and, doing much of it on my own time and treating it like a job in a lot of ways is really because I think it helps and I think it's necessary. One of your countrymen I spoke to recently through this whole project, right? So through the whole Blue Grit thing, similar to what you're doing, we were talking about why I even started doing all this stuff on social media and the podcast. And I shared with him that I wondered if it was even worth having one more voice. I was like, man, do we really need like another public engagement, just kind of Instagram account like that? Or do we really need another police podcast? And then he quickly was like, hey, it's not like another one, but like you're competing. It's like, it's another one because you're going to have that much more exposure to the shared messages. It's not so much like they need to hear it from you, but you recognize that there are people in your life, and you recognize that there are people that might connect better with you than they will with me. And I think that's totally true, right? I'm a different person. That's part of why I share my thoughts and my reflections. I know I'm not going to resonate with every cop, but a lot of them might resonate a lot better with you, Larry, right? And so that's all part of the communal effort. Yeah, I mean, as far as like the public engagement stuff, I think that that's where we're suffering, and that's where we need to step up in order to repair public trust, in order to move the needle and show that we are on the same team. Cops really do give a damn, and that's why they do the job they do, is to provide a safer, better community. And so that it doesn't, and it shouldn't be this dichotomy where it's, where we're at odds with each other. And that's what we see with a lot of the public scrutiny. So to zigzag back to even the testing stuff for getting in and hiring, that's front of mind because I'm the hiring sergeant at my department. But I am reminded of how hard it was and how you pointed it out, how non-existent it was to find a lot of this information when we came into the career. You were geared towards a life of service. For me, not knowing anyone personally, it was trial by fire. But I mean, I think that there's no point in that. I know a lot of my friends that had law enforcement in the family or a close family friend, and they were able to get the context and kind of figure out the process a little quicker. So it's just trying to be a resource. I know that some old school counterparts of ours might think I'm providing the answer key, and it's certainly not really. It's just, I feel like I'm providing a study guide, but just like anything, the ones that are going to show up well are just going to show up better. And your poor candidates it's not going to help them at all anyway, because they're not the right people. They're not of the right values and the right cloth. So me giving them interview tips isn't really going to do anything to help them or hurt the process.
No, I think you're sharing it as what the reality is, because if it's someone that knew you, or it was, I don't know, a friend you went to high school with, Eric, and then his kid all of a sudden wanted to be a police officer and wanted to talk to you, and well, how do I prepare? Well, it's not a secret. You can tell him how he needs to prepare. You can't tell him the questions around the exam, because how the hell do you know them all? You can't provide this individual with life experience. That's what they bring to it. But it's just about, here's some things maybe you need to consider. And I personally am 100% in agreement with you that we are struggling right now finding enough people to fill the boots that are needed for the communities to be properly policed. And so why are we making things more difficult on people who could be fantastic candidates? Your ability to write an exam or do well in an interview doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a great cop.
No, not at all.
There's a lot more to it, right? So if you're at least taking that stress point off, man, there's nothing wrong with that. We need people. Erica, we're going to take a quick break, and everyone, when we come back from the break, we are going to talk a little bit more about the mental health struggle amongst first responders, and I really want to hear from Eric on what's the plans in the near future for Blue Grit Radio.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into the podcast. If you have experience with post-traumatic stress and would like to join me for an episode, please reach out to me. You can contact me via direct message on Instagram, PTSD_podcast, or you can send me an email at Papa Tango Sierra Delta podcast @gmail.com. Cheers.
We are back from the break once again with Eric Tung, the host and founder of Blue Grit Radio, and also a 16-year continuing to serve member of a police force in Washington State. Eric, thank you very much again for joining the show.
Yeah, man, of course.
Mental health wise, again, one last thing I want to make sure I hit on is after a critical incident occurs where you are, what steps are in place to ensure that members are being properly debriefed, being properly given the opportunities to speak? And while you think of that, Eric, I mean, one of the things I'll just share is that, as a junior member, I had 4.5 years in my first post and worked alone pretty much all the time. I mean, if you encountered a critical incident, there was no debriefing because it was you. You might on the day shift come in and be able to talk to a couple of the guys about it, but generally you kind of had to figure out how to deal with it all. Certainly times have changed. I mean, we're talking 21 years ago. How is it things done down your way?
Yeah, so we are trying to be more frequent with doing critical stress debriefs, right? So, there's a critical incident, and for the listeners, that can be such a range of things. And unfortunately, in a higher crime area, it's too frequent to even do a debrief, that's truly facilitated by peer support. I know some departments have a mental health professional at these, so just the list is logistically improbable to do at the frequency where it'd be most beneficial. But just to go down that road a little bit to explain it, basically let's say you have 4 or 5 officers go to a call. It's extremely stressful. Maybe there was a fight with a subject. Maybe there was a significant force used by the officers, like a shooting even, right? Or maybe it was not even that type of law enforcement function. Maybe it was just something extremely traumatic, extremely sad. Something happened to a kid, or a significant injury or death, of a child, or just a really sad situation. We recognize there's an extreme amount of stress, an extreme amount of trauma. And so when we can, we try to schedule pretty quickly a gathering of those officers involved. For our department, it's generally voluntary. I know a lot of departments are starting to make it mandatory, and as much as I hate things that are mandatory, and cops, firefighters, everyone hates things that are mandatory, I have heard a lot of positive reception. So you can take that back to your agency. For places that do have mandatory actions, generally the officers are saying it's working well. But in any case, you get together, it's peer support supported, it's kept confidential, and like I mentioned, there usually be a mental health professional or a chaplain or a trained debrief facilitator, and I'm one, to guide the officer or involved personnel through their experience. And the focus is on filling in the gaps of what people did and really what they experienced, what they felt during, what they felt after. And then it goes into shared experience and self-care. And so it does lead towards talking about how are people sleeping, okay, or what are we using that are coping mechanisms, and here are the things to avoid. These reminders that might sound obvious, but again, we need these reminders because we can get stuck in the rut of just go, and back in the saddle, kind of like you were talking about earlier, Larry. But I would say that the bigger thing, and we talked about it a couple of times, we kind of hinted at it, is peer support, right? Wherever you can get it. Earlier in the podcast episode, you were talking about a mental health professional or a practitioner that understands the lingo and the jargon, and that can be really hard to find. So in place of that, there's an opportunity in peer support and just checking in on your guys, your gals. So often we, I think, make it too much about who's wearing the peer support hat. And while there are benefits to an official title, sometimes protected speech or privileged conversation, however, in place of that, just check in with your people. Let them know that you're there and be redundant about it. Too often we hear, contrary to, I think, what we hear growing up, is that, there's always a sign of suicide. I remember learning that in high school. There's always signs, so look out for the signs. But more recently, I'm hearing that there's not always signs. I mean, a lot of people's closest friends and family, they harm themselves or they suicide, and they didn't see it coming. So I think, part of one of the themes of this whole thing is that if you know someone or you are a first responder, then there's your sign. You're going to have these crazy exposures that will make you more susceptible towards depression, towards anxiety, towards these irrational feelings that you described earlier, where you know that you're not technically alone, but you feel so alone and things seem so dark and so bleak. And so recognize that and then do embrace these systems, these practices, these communities, just to try to better navigate it, because you aren't alone.
I love that. Eric, you hit a home run on that one, buddy. Just saying, there's your sign. You're a first responder, you're military, you're vet. There's your sign right there. You don't need anything else. Brother, that is very, very well said. And the reality is that there are no signs because we're not sharing those signs in terms of talking about things, showing anything in terms of self-harm. No, we keep that all bundled inside, and that is ultimately what really and truly leads to our demise.
And I mean, you talked about it earlier as far as like just all the things of 20 plus years piling up, right? And I think that more often, if I had to venture a guess, and there might be a statistic out there somewhere, but I think it's so much less about those standout incidents, right? Maybe a fight for life, or maybe a shooting. I think it's more about all those calls you go to over the years, and all those times that something almost happened, or you felt like something almost happened. The times that you almost wrecked, or the times that you almost pulled the trigger. I found personally that those things are much more heavy on the psyche. The second guessing, like you were talking about earlier, right? The perfecting of what you did or didn't do. Kind of those playbacks that become so much heavier than the one or two kind of catastrophic events that someone might see from the outside.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. And the only other thing I'll add to that is the other thing that outside of catastrophic, tragic events is just a support issue, just feeling a complete and utter lack of support, and just not feeling that there was anything there. Just the whole ideology, Eric, kind of like suck it up, buttercup, move on. You know what you got involved in, you know what you joined, you know what you're doing. And so push forward. And that you start just doing things like that, and you start, as I always say, shoving things under the rug. And so I never processed any of these memories, any of these events, any of these situations, including the ones you're constantly reassessing yourself. I never processed them. I just threw them under a rug. And about 3 years ago, it's like the wind changed, and it all just came out at once, and it was significantly uglier than any one of them were on their own. It was just the fact that it created together kind of a monster, I guess, for lack of a better term. And so that's the key, brother. Yeah, is, again, I agree with you, man. Peer support, talking, getting out there, speaking out. And when it comes to these buddy checks, which, awesome. But if you ask me, hey, man, how you doing? I'm going to respond, I'm doing good. I'm okay. It's what we do. It's almost like just a learned response, because you can't help but wonder too, is that other person really want me to say how I'm feeling? But if you come back, if you and I go to a call, Eric, and it's a traumatic one, it definitely is one that would leave scars, and you've got 16 and I've got 21. I mean, I think the conversation needs to be, if I'm checking on you, not how are you doing? It needs to be more like, Eric, I don't know how you're doing with that one, but I'm going to tell you, man, that was some pretty wild shit that's going to leave a scar on me.
I love that.
Yeah, and at least it makes you more comfortable to talk, as opposed to, the senior member, the old, sour friggin' bastard that's here. It's just going, how are you doing, kid? No, not at all. That was some scary shit, man. I'm flipped out about that. And I think that's going to open a lot more doors. You agree?
For sure. Yeah. And I think that simple, it's almost like a mini debrief, or some people call it a diffusing, right? Maybe it's after the call, people are about to clear off to go do something else. But especially if you have that veteran officer, which these days might be like 3 or 5 year officer.
It's true, right?
Change with the times, right? But to again, provide that example to say like, hey, that was messed up. And just read the faces, right? And so when I say check in and see how people are doing, yeah, it's going to probably be less about what they actually say, but these are your people, right? You're spending more time with each other than you are at home. And so, right? And maybe they're saying they're fine, but maybe their actions and their demeanor doesn't really illustrate that. Then, do get uncomfortable, right? Do press. And that's one thing that I think is commonly shared as far as people that are suicidal or depressed, is that they generally don't take offense, when you say, hey, I'm worried about you. You're not seeming right. I care about you. I just want to check in. Like, tell me what's going on. Tell me how I can help.
Absolutely.
And let's just say if the cost, if you're wrong, is someone being perturbed that you were, you know, a little nosy, a little annoying, I'd say that's a fine price to pay.
Yeah, I'm okay. Eric, I frequently say I've got enough friends. I don't need any more. I just want to make sure you're gonna get up tomorrow morning, right? Like, that's the reality of it. I just want to make sure you're okay.
Yeah.
You know, you may not be my friend and you may not like me, but you are my brother or you are my sister,
Mm-hmm.
and we do share the same shoulder flash.
Yeah.
And I say the same. I don't care what it says. I really could care what color it is or what geographical location is mapped on it. I don't care.
Yeah.
We share the same one, and we have to be there for each other, whether you like it or not, whether you like me or not. Because ultimately, if we don't take care of each other, well, who's taking care of us? Eric, I really want to hear what's on the horizon for Blue Grit. I mean, what's the upcoming plans? Do you have any special episodes, any guests coming up? Where do you see this playing out? What's on the horizon, brother?
Yeah, man. So I'll say, like, just kind of been building, and there is a part of me and my natural tendencies, for those that know me well, is to over anticipate and over plan. And in some ways that, you know, you think about police work, it's finding those contingencies, and they can be almost paralyzing, right? Paralysis by analysis. So with this project, it's kind of like I'm going to build it and see where it goes. And so far, it has been pleasant surprises. You know, I did an episode with my close friend, and just kind of catching up with some other guys I know. And I kind of pitched it to them and said it was really cool to connect in this way. And so far, I've had a lot of really positive feedback and excitement to come on. So, you know, so it's a couple cops that I've worked with for a number of years, as well as just trying to put out different resources, right? So financial coach, counselor, and more people just in the general space, in and out of police work. And I'm talking with a dude, Clay, that served in the military, and now he's a physical trainer and, you know, martial artist. So it's just a lot of these lessons, you know, to aid our physicality, to aid our mental state, just to make us all better, whether we wear the uniform or not. But yeah, that's kind of what's on the horizon for me.
That's awesome.
Like I nodded to earlier, it's a lot parallel of what I'm doing in my 40 plus hours a week. So a lot of hiring and finding the next generation, or trying to support the next generation of first responders. At the same time, wearing a training hat right now, that's where, you know, my head's in training, and it does, you know, bleed into, you know, officer safety and vigilance and things like that as well. So you get whatever's on my mind and then some.
And why the hell would anybody want anything else, brother? They should get what's on your mind.
Yeah, man.
Speaking of which, you're awesome. Listen, man, the first time we talked, I was like, okay, I like this guy.
Oh, thanks, man. Yeah, with the listeners, you know, like, I started listening to your podcast, a couple episodes. I was like, man, this guy, he has a great tone, and not just an audible tone, but like what he says, not just how he says it. And so, yeah, not to butter you up to your listeners, but I really do think that the more the merrier. We need more people having this voice, and we need more of the right people. And for seasoned veterans, especially like yourself, that had zero training, zero exposure and curriculum to these things, and you know, you had that hard recognition with your family, and you work through it. You continue to work through it. It is truly, and I know I've used the word courage several times, but it's such a front of mind topic for me, especially being mid-career for myself, and trying to think of how I can affect policing in general in the biggest and best way. And projects like yours and Blue Grit, I believe, is one step that can help me do that and scale it and reach more people. You know, I'd love to reach the audience that you're reaching. So this is fantastic. And I think that truly more voices is going to be extremely helpful to help us keep moving the direction we need to.
I'm with you. Thanks, man. And I'm with you. And hopefully this gets more listeners over your way, because here's the reality. You know, you said earlier when your concern was, you know, does this need another voice? It needs whatever voice is going to get out there, and whatever voice people are going to connect with and resonate with. So if that's my voice, great. Thank you. If that's Eric's voice, great. Thank you. If that's someone else, wherever else, great. Thank you. Our concern is for our brothers and sisters' well-being. And ultimately, That's what we want. It's not an anything else. I am not paid a cent for this. And I do this because I genuinely care. And Eric, I'm presuming the same thing with you, right?
It's a weird hobby, I call it.
Right, yeah, because you're actually trying to give back. You're actually trying to take care of others like you. And yeah, man, just as long as people listen. So go over, check out the Blue Grit Radio podcast. You can get it on any podcast service, I presume, Eric. I know that I listen to it on Apple. It's on Spotify. It shouldn't be difficult for people to find.
Those two, Amazon, and I know the podcast world I'm learning about gets uploaded to a couple of others. Smaller ones. But yeah, those three main ones are going to be the easiest spot.
And as well, I strongly recommend you give Eric a follow on Instagram. It's under Blue Grit Wellness. I mean, look, if you couldn't tell from the episode, an amazing person to be in contact with, a fantastic resource who genuinely gives a shit about members. And so, yeah, something to remember, something to think about, something to live by. Eric, before we end off, is there anything that you would like to add? Anything else you want to say? This, sir, is your time and you have the floor.
I would say be patient. Be patient with your career, where it's going to take you, and be patient with your process. The dance with traumatic stress is going to be ongoing. Be patient. Give yourself grace. Even if it's one step forward, two steps back, just recognize you can take that step forward again. So you're not alone, and you got this.
Well said, brother. Well said. Thank you once again, Eric, for joining the episode. And for those people on Blue Grit Radio that are listening to me, I sincerely appreciate your time as well. One thing to take away from this episode is that, as I've said before, PTSD has no borders. It is not in any way, shape, or form an illness and injury that has any stereotypes, any racial profiles, any gender profiles. PTSD doesn't give a shit who you are. It doesn't give a shit where you came from. It doesn't give a shit where you're going. When it hits you, it hits you. And we're all together in that. Mental health is important in policing, in frontline work, in military, in veterans, in everything. In everything. And I'm saying that a second time because although this show is focused on frontliners, everybody can be affected by this. Think about that. Realize that. Tune into Blue Grit Radio. Listen to Eric. Give him a follow. Make sure we take care of each other and support each other. That's the key. You want people to keep stepping up and talking out, being there for you, then you need to support them as well. My name is Larry Payton. I have your 6. Please also have mine.
Don't go away. There's so much left to do, so many things I wanna say, and I sing, hey, don't make the change. If it rains every single day, I'll fight to blow it all away.